Thank you again for sticking around for the continuation of our Kenya marathon, which I think is maybe an apt metaphor, given their dominance of that particular sport. Although I say that with some trepidation, knowing that our next panel is going to include a host of Ethiopians who might challenge that assertion. But the next conversation will be vying for regional leadership in the Horn of Africa, Kenya and Ethiopia, competitors or partners. I'm Cameron Hudson. I'm a senior fellow here in the Africa program at CSIS, and it's my great pleasure and honor to moderate this upcoming panel and talk a little bit about this report that has been written, which, as has been said before, is available on the CSIS website. You know, we're going to take a little bit of a broader look in this panel. The last discussion really focused deeply on one country, the DRC in particular, and I think now we're going to look at a very large region, a region depending on how we define its boundaries of 150 million people, or northwards of over 200 million people if we include such garden spots as Sudan in that list, which I think for the purposes of the conversation today we should, given Kenya's long-standing role in trying to mediate peace in Sudan at various points in its history. This is a very dynamic region. Unlike the EAC region, we have two what have been called hegemons. They've been called anchor states. I think the report uses both terms interchangeably. And so we're going to ask some questions about whether these two countries are partners or they're competitors, or maybe they're both, and maybe they're both anchor states, and maybe they're neither anchor states, depending upon the moment in time that we're talking about. But needless to say, the rise and fall of these nations within this region, you know, is really a reflection of the dynamism of the region. And I guess maybe dynamism is a charitable way of describing the Horn of Africa. It can otherwise be thought of as a deeply unstable region, as a region which has experienced and is experiencing coups and political instability and civil war and international war on a scale that really, I think, even on a continent that has known its fair share of challenges, I think stands above other regions for the level and the sustained level of instability. And so I think it's a really interesting question that we pose today, asking about whether or not these two countries are anchor states, and what does that mean for the region. I'm excited to bring to the stage two co-authors of the report, and then we'll be joined for a conversation with my friend Vemba at the end to have a conversation about what has been discussed. I want to first invite to the stage Dr. Mochofi Sango. He is a lecturer in political science at the University of Nairobi and the deputy director of the Security Research Information Center there. After that, we will be joined on stage for some opening remarks by Ale Odomin, who is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford, focused on governance, security, nationalism, and democratization in the Horn of Africa region. He was previously a policy advisor at the Office of the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, and has been a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, among many other accomplishments. So, Dr. Mochofi, I want to invite you to the stage to offer some opening remarks. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I think it is still morning. My name is Singo Mochofi. I'm from Kenya, born and bred in Kenya. And I am here to speak briefly, I must say, about the research and the report that myself and two colleagues have developed on the question as to whether first the Horn of Africa has a hegemonic state. There are two major powers there, Ethiopia and Kenya. The jury is out as to which one of these. If you speak to an Ethiopian, they'll tell you, no, it's Ethiopia. If you speak to a Kenyan, they'll say it's a Kenyan. But I think the core issue that we are talking about here is peace diplomacy in the Horn of Africa. And we are looking at it in the context of these two key states in the region whose leadership, or the lack of it, if you will, has had a tremendous impact on whether it is issues of diplomacy or peace building or generally the interregional relations. This, in terms of methodology, this report was undertaken through a qualitative study. We had a series of interviews with key informants in Nairobi and in Addis Ababa, and of course complement that with secondary data. And so we are presenting to you the findings of a rigorous research exercise. So some of the views that we may present may not necessarily be ours, but what we have found from the field. I don't know whether the screen will be put on for me. Yes, there you are. So I'll introduce this, then I'll speak to the aspects of the report that relate to Kenya, and then my brother will speak to the aspects of the report that relate to Ethiopia. Then I'll come back to conclude and speak about the recommendations. In terms of context, I think this has been discussed also earlier by colleagues who spoke before me. In the context of peace diplomacy, Africa accounts for nearly 70% of the peace and security questions that are discussed or posed at the UN Security Council. Now, if that is the case, then it means that peace and security questions are critical in the context of Africa. The Greater Horn of Africa, which the moderator said earlier, depends on how you define it. So you can have a narrow definition, you can have a wider definition of it. Happens to be one of the most conflict-prone regions in the continent. And it's a region that has been characterized by civil wars, military coups, insurgency movements, secessionist movements, cross-border organized crime, terrorism. We have active terrorism activities going on. We have countries in this region now at the moment that are embroiled in civil war, at least 2 or 3 of those. When you look at Sudan, when you look at Somalia, the jury is still out there whether Somalia has become a stable state. It's not. The DRC, the eastern parts of the DRC, if you listen to the media now, you hear that the rebels of M23 have captured now I think so far 3 major towns in the east. You don't know which one is next. So it's a region that is unstable. But yet it also has positive stories. And one of those positive stories is we have stable economies in this zone. We have countries that have been relatively peaceful, Kenya being one of them, and that have attempted to take leadership in terms of ensuring the region is stable. Sometimes with varying degrees of success, but I think it is important to point out those positives. Within the region, the IGAD economic community is a major actor in the context of peace, regional peace and security, but also the EAC in terms of this cross-membership or multiple membership of states to regional economic communities that somebody spoke about earlier, where you find, for example, the DRC is also a member of SADC. Here, Kenya is a member of EAC. It's also a member of IGAD. Uganda the same. And so the two, IGAD and EAC, remain the main active or more relevant regional organizations when it comes to peace and security issues. Now, in terms of peace diplomacy, Kenya certainly stands out. Kenya has been an active member, an active state in terms of trying to ensure the space where it is herself is located as a state, but also at the regional level, peace and stability is maintained. And this has been the very first speaker who spoke from Taiwan highlighted this question very well by noting that this is not something that started happening yesterday. It's been a long process, especially, in fact, since independence. So the 1980s and 1990s that also happened to have been the times where instability was at the highest in the region. In terms of when you look at Burundi, Central African Republic, the DRC, Ethiopia itself, which is represented here today, Rwanda, Somalia, Sudan, all these countries were engulfed in problems, instability and civil war. Now, Kenya established a legacy in terms of intervening and trying to find stability and peace as a neutral arbiter. Yeah? The question sometimes is posed as to whether a country can be fully neutral, or is neutrality hinged on pursuit of national interests? Whatever the case is, for the context of Kenya here, I think it is fair to say that because of our own stability, because Kenya has been lucky, we have been lucky, I must say, we have not been involved in major instability except in 2008, 2007, 2008 post-election violence that threatened to tear the country apart. Other than that particular incident and an attempted coup in 1982, the country has been fairly stable. And I think that stability has been the single most important factor that has facilitated or has been an enabler of Kenya's interventions or success, if you can call it, in terms of our interventions in trying to stabilize her neighbors, who have incidentally been almost all of them characterized by instability. Uganda, Ethiopia, Somalia, South Sudan. Tanzania is the exception, which is Kenya's neighbor to the south. Tanzania, like Kenya, has also been lucky to be stable, not to have been destabilized from inside. So that stability has been a critical factor influencing Kenya's role and leadership in peace diplomacy. The other factor has been, and has also been alluded to earlier here, a stable economy. The Kenyan economy, the previous moderator spoke about attributes of Kenya's economy that have really seen it stand to be counted and enabled it to make the kind of interventions it has been making. I think in 2021, Kenya's economy was worth $110 billion in terms of GDP. The current GDP per capita stands to about 2,200. These may not be very significant figures from people from the developed world, but when you look at it from the context of us in the South, that economic statistic has been critical. Kenya has a developed infrastructure. Our ambassador spoke earlier when he was inviting you to visit our country. You will find, for example, if you come to Nairobi, that we have an expressway. I think it's only Somalia that has something close to Kenya when it comes to, it's only Ethiopia, that has got a comparable development in terms of infrastructure in the region. So the economy has been a key factor in explaining Kenya's leadership in peace diplomacy. The third point is about what you can call idiosyncratic variables, the kind of leadership that the country has had over the years since independence. We have had 5 presidents, are they 5 or 4? Kenyatta, Uhuru, Kenyatta, Kibaki, and Uhuru, and now William Ruto. So 4. And each one of those leaders has had their own style of leadership. Kenyatta was seen as did I count Moi? Kenyatta, Moi, Kibaki, and then, of course, Kenyatta 2, the son of the Kenyatta 1, and William Ruto. So there are 5. Each one of them was seen to have their own style of leadership when it came to diplomacy. Kenyatta was a Pan-Africanist. You know, the Kenyatta one belonged to the founders of the nation, the African nationalists who took independence from the colonialists, and their message was about uniting Africa, you know, creating unity and the development of purpose. Then Moi when he took office, was seen more as an internationalist trying to spread Kenya's influence far and wide. Kibaki, when he took over, he was seen to be a more inward-looking president, building the economy, and he succeeded tremendously. Uhuru was seen as someone more interested in pushing the economic agenda, but also building regional integration, creating the space for, you know, economics to grow inwardly and expanding to the region. The jury's out about William Ruto's presidency when it comes to diplomacy, etc. So those three factors explain, well, one can have maybe others to add, explain the Kenyan leadership in terms of peace diplomacy in the region. In terms of foreign policy, which I will also anchor on the context of the idiosyncratic variables and the leadership that has been in office, you see three eras in terms of Kenya's evolving foreign policy. The independence era, which is the 60s, the post-independence era, 70s to the 2000s, and what you can call the modern era from 2000s to the present. And you find during these eras, especially this so-called modern era, Kenya has had a higher interest in regional stability, building peace, and enhancing cooperation in the region. And that peace diplomacy, today, in the context of, when you speak about the present, it is more about interoperationalizing. I should be moving with my screen, sorry about that. It's more about interoperationalizing domestic and foreign policy in service of Kenya's economic goals in a volatile region. When this previous panel was speaking, I almost made an intervention to say that one other explanation for the foray of Kenya into DR Congo in terms of banking and so on must also be seen in the context of elite interests, the interplay of the ruling elite in terms of their advancement of their economic interests, and which sometimes is interpreted or passed on as public interest or the national interest for that matter. That has been a factor as well in terms of the fact that when you look at the Kenyan economy, the elites that control the Kenyan economy have also seen the advantage in terms of they are benefiting economically from expanding peace in the region so that their companies can take advantage of that. And I think a best example is that explanation in the DR Congo that was spoken about earlier. In terms of foreign policy also, Kenya has been a leader in peacekeeping and peacemaking. Yeah, UN peacekeeping operations around in the region. I think in total now, Kenya has, the ambassador spoke about 48 peacekeeping operations around the world that Kenya has been involved in. Our research found 44. I don't think whether that's a big gap. Yeah, we noted 44 instances, and that Kenya currently ranks about number 22 globally and 13th in Africa in terms of troop contributions to UN peacekeeping forces. So Kenya has led in peacekeeping, but also in peacemaking in terms of its interventions to mediate peace. The very current example of Kenya's mediation in the Congo, the gentleman from Congo spoke about the failure of the regional force, where Kenya was leader. But I think there is also another dynamic in that context of that failure, which is, in my view, that the EAC force that deployed Kenyan troops in the DRC, that happened during the presidency of William Ruto, of Uhuru Kenyatta. And it has been established here that the relationship between William Ruto and Tshisekedi at a personal level was excellent. But domestic issues in Kenya determined that the relationship between the current president, William Ruto, and the former president, Uhuru Kenyatta, was not very cozy, because Uhuru decided to support Ruto's opponent in the elections in Kenya in 2022. And so when the mandate of that regional force ended, the Tshisekedi government did not renew that mandate, and the force was taken back to Kenya. And it is after that that the current scenario has unfolded, the scenario of now the expansion of the M23 attacks and the takeover of Goma and takeover of Bukavu, etc., etc. So one might want to look at, to interrogate really whether the failure of that regional force is the failure of the force, or is it these dynamics of the differences in leadership and that have then resulted into the happenings that have happened in Eastern Congo. The other point I want to make is about, in the context of Kenyan foreign policy, Kenya has also projected soft power. And this soft power has been instrumental in fueling her success in terms of leadership in peacemaking and peace diplomacy in the region. The credibility of Kenya that has come out of the fact that it's been a stable country, strong leadership, strong economy has allowed her to have leverage in terms of leadership in peace diplomacy. Now, regionally also, Nairobi has been indisputably, I don't know whether anybody can dispute the fact that for any actor, especially from elsewhere, from the West, anyone wanting to influence, peace outcomes in the region, the place to call has been Nairobi. So Nairobi has been a busy peace capital and hub of summit diplomacy because of this, history of credibility and stability. Kenya has also been one of the largest hosts of refugees in the Horn of African region because of the instability around. Currently, Kenya has 3 refugee camps, and most of the refugees in those camps, which are to the north of the country, are from Somalia, from DR Congo, from South Sudan. There are a few from Ethiopia, a few from Burundi. And this humanitarian, intervention has also helped project Kenya in terms of soft power and influence in the region. One has to say also the fact that there have also been changes. There have been changing dynamics in the context of security and external dynamics within the region that when you speak about Kenya's leadership in peace diplomacy come into play. And I want to mention 3 or 4 points here. That external support has helped Kenya to emerge on global platforms, including 3 times as the African non-permanent member on the UN Security Council. I don't think you become a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, without good bearing. Yeah. So Kenya has for 3 times served as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. It has occupied, positions within being invited into G7 summits and meetings. It is in 2024, and this is controversial, Kenya was designated as a major NATO ally during the presidency of Joe Biden. Around that time, Ethiopia also acceded to the BRICS platform, which brings together countries that are seen to oppose the current international status quo. They want more space for the southern countries. And this is one element where, when you speak about Kenya-Ethiopia competition, is one element that you want to look at. The Kenya's designation by America as a NATO ally has been a controversial development, where it is seen as indication of Kenya being used increasingly by the Americans to perform tasks that the Americans themselves may not be willing or want to perform. For example, the interventions in Haiti, which when you go to Kenya, you will find that majority of the people oppose that our police forces in Haiti when our country is suffering from serious security challenges. And then the other point I want to make here is about the fact in the context of these changing security dynamics that the the era of a single regional power, operating as an anchor state in the Horn of Africa, may be getting over. I mean, because you have other new powers that are emerging. Tanzania is emerging as an increasing important actor. If you listened earlier on about the dynamics in the Congo, Tanzania is an important player in Congo economically. The previous panel told us it's actually Tanzania that is number one in terms of trading with the DR Congo. Tanzania is a key ally of Burundi. Tanzania is a key state in SADC, and the East African community SADC dynamic came into play during the recent elections of the African Union chairperson, where our candidate lost. And when you explain that loss, it comes down to the fact that the SADC vote was lost. And the SADC vote was lost because of the differences between the leadership in SADC and the EAC. So that is important. So new dynamics are happening that are increasingly pointing to the fact that other major powers are coming out. Ethiopia as well is becoming also a very, very serious player in the region. So one may want to talk about multiple states emerging. Is this good for the region? Probably yes, if the competition is contained, and we shall go back to the recommendations to see how that plays out. Finally, in terms of challenges, I spoke earlier about the fact of the personality differences in terms of leadership and how this has now played negatively and have dented Kenya's leadership, hitherto leadership in peace diplomacy in the region, because it is seen like as if after President Ruto took over, he was very keen to undo or to change, pretty much like what is happening in the United States here now after President Trump took over power. Seen to like undoing everything that was done by the previous administration. And for that reason, you find now relations between Kenya and DRC, which was important in terms of propping the peace process in Eastern Congo, is negatively affected. Relations between Ethiopia and Kenya, which were quite positive during the presidency of Uhuru, because Uhuru was very close to Abiy, is a question mark as how it is right now. So those personality and the leadership differences may be a problem in terms of Kenya's leadership moving forward. I want to stop there to allow the next speaker to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singo. Good morning again. I will try to keep it brief because it's a Kenya party and I don't want to spoil it. But I think the whole idea of, including Ethiopia in this whole research and in this exercise is to add some nuance regarding this somehow exaggerated conception of Kenya as the new anchor in the Horn and in the DRC. I think a number of geographic, historical, demographic, and geopolitical elements I'll try to mention briefly in the next 10 to 15 minutes. We'll try to, shed light on some important points that may limit Kenya's ambition, Kenya's reach and influence in two regions. In the Great Lakes in Central Africa, but at the same time in the Horn, in the Greater Horn. So basically, I think my presentation will mostly focus on trying to locate Ethiopia and Ethiopia's foreign policy through time and space, through history, and how this specific critical and historical juncture in the history of Ethiopia and Ethiopia's foreign policy will determine its regional role, its relations with Kenya, and position itself in a fast-changing global order. So, to quickly go through key facts is that one of the most defining element of Ethiopian state is its independence, or its it was able to defeat European colonialism. And looking deep into that historical fact, you can see that diplomacy was very crucial in mobilizing resources and building the state capability that resulted in defeating European colonialism. Yes, it has a very long and continuous history of statehood, but at the same time, as previous speaker rightfully highlighted, it also had a very troubled history that is full of civil wars and wars with its neighbors. It has its nationhood and statehood was violently contested through decades. You cannot find a decade without a major war, a civil war within or a war with a neighboring state in the history of Ethiopia's existence in the past 60 years. And the state also has an authoritarian legacy, unlike Kenya, which had some kind of a hybrid regime with certain level of democratic elections and a vibrant civil society and media. The Ethiopian state has a very long history of statehood, but at the same time, very long history of authoritarian legacy. But it's a very big country, and it's located at the heart of the Horn of Africa, neighboring literally all of the Horn of African states. Its population is 40% of the IGAD overall population. It's the 10th biggest country in the world by population. And probably within the next decade, it will take over Russia to be the 9th biggest country in the world. It has the largest military in the Horn, possibly the largest economy as well. There are debates regarding who's the biggest, depending on the calculations between Ethiopia and Kenya. And one most important point is, of course, internal vulnerabilities has significantly weakened its regional international standing in the past few years. So basically, in the next few slides, I'll try to come up with a pattern. What explains Ethiopia's foreign policy, especially the foreign policy in the past few years, in light of recurrent trends and patterns with successive regimes in Ethiopia, and how would the next years would shape Ethiopia's foreign policy in the Horn and its relations with Kenya. So I will start with Haile Selassie. And in the Ethiopia joined the League of Nations in 1924. And there was a lot of excitement about that decision to join the international organization and community of nations. And there was a lot of trust and faith in multilateralism in the global order. And of course, at the time of Second World War, Second World War didn't start in 1939 in Europe, it started in 1936 in Africa when fascist Italy invaded Ethiopia. So Ethiopia sent a delegation, of course, led by Haile Selassie, as you see in the picture, addressing the League of Nations in Geneva. And Ethiopia was betrayed by the League of Nations. So it has significantly affected how Ethiopia looks at the world. And it has shaped its foreign policy in the decades that followed. Of course, in the Cold War period and in the post-Second World War period, Ethiopia took its lessons and significantly diversified its foreign policy, diversified its partners. Haile Selassie was an astute diplomat. He, of course, was at the forefront of the creation of the OAU. He was also a respected member of the non-aligned movement. He also took part in the collective security initiatives, sending peacekeeping troops in Korea and Katanga in Congo. And he made friends from the East and the West. As you can see in this pictures, you can see him with Khrushchev in Moscow, with Churchill and with Mao, and of course among the leaders, the founding leaders of the OAU in 1963. So it's that moment of betrayal or sense of betrayal at the League of Nations has significantly shifted Ethiopian foreign policy and how it looks at its international relations and regional role. Kind of the same pattern happened when the 1974 revolution happened and the military took over. And in the first few years of the Derg regime, there was a lot of socialist utopianism and an assumption, a belief that we can build cooperation with our regional partners based on socialist solidarity. But of course, a few years down the line, Ethiopia was invaded by Ziad Barre's Somalia, and that has significantly shifted Ethiopia's foreign policy and its alliance. And it started to take a more proactive and more aggressive and assertive role in regional and continental issues, supporting liberation movements, supporting even rebel movements of neighboring countries. 91, and of course, it's end of history, of course, the fall of the Derg regime, and the new government that took over from the Derg in 1991, it's adopted another very normative foreign policy that put a lot of trust in the new order of the 90s. The EPRDF, led by Meles Zenawi, defined Ethiopia's biggest problem to be poverty, and it adopted a very inward-looking foreign policy, saying that Ethiopia's problem in previous regimes didn't come from abroad. It came from the previous regimes, not necessarily because we have enemies. We've been our own enemies in a way. So there was also conflict fatigue because that regime came out of a 17 years civil war. So it has significantly reduced the military by like 1/10. At a point in the late 80s, the Ethiopian army, both the regular army and the reserve, was close to 500,000. Now it was reduced to 50,000 troops. And it developed a foreign policy that's based on cooperation, regional integration, and trust. And there was a point when it was not supporting any rebel movements from neighboring countries. But it had a rude awakening. Basically, they learned the hard way that Ethiopia, because of its geography, its location, its history, and demography, cannot stay a passive actor, a passive player in regional and international issues. The two major events was, of course, there was an assassination attempt on Hosni Mubarak, the president of Egypt, in 1995, supported by the Sudanese government. And of course, there was also the Al Ittihad al-Islamiyya threat from Somalia. But most importantly, I think the war with Eritrea from 1998 to 2001 has significantly changed how Ethiopia articulated its foreign and regional security policy. So it somehow shook this very, a foreign policy that was based on idealism, cooperation, and partnership to a much more realist and proactive foreign policy from 2001 to 2012. In this decade, Ethiopia became much more proactive. It was a decade of diplomatic and economic rise. Apparently, the funny thing is, from 1991 to 2001, Ethiopia didn't have a foreign policy. So it adopted a proper foreign policy in 2001, of course, authored by former Prime Minister Meles Zenawi. It became an active player in IGAD, in peacekeeping, in climate change negotiations, and it came up with a number of projects, the hydroelectric projects, infrastructure projects, trade, investment, to build regional integration and cooperation through economic and infrastructure projects. It also took, through Meles Zenawi, an ideological leadership on issues of African unity at NEPAD, at the African peer review mechanism, and it was an era of Ethiopia's diplomatic and economic rise. This is a picture, that represents, of course, the IGAD member states, Meles Zenawi at G7 meeting, peacekeeping, and of course, regional integration policy based on energy. And you see the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. It also played a balancing act at that period where it tried to keep good relationship with the West and the East. It has a very good relationship with both the EU and the US, but at the same time, it built strong relationship with China, India, and other middle and emerging powers. And it put most of its investment on multilateral engagements and platforms. So its regional policy in that period, and more or less until 2018, was based on this major elements. It was containment with Eritrea. Of course, it sponsored numerous sanctions to alienate Eritrea. Intervention in Somalia through AU and IGAD. Strong alliance and economic partnership with Sudan. It also took a number of peace diplomacy and even deployment of peacekeeping troops in South Sudan. Of course, it had the most stable, the most predictable relationship Ethiopia had, both in economy, diplomacy, and politics, has been with Kenya. And of course, integration with Djibouti through the railway, the use of ports, export of food items, water, and energy to Djibouti, and a strong friendship with Somaliland. And GERD, the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, was considered as the foundation of Ethiopia's foreign policy, the foundation of Ethiopia's regional aspiration, and its ambition for a more connected Horn of Africa. So we fast forward 2018. We started, there was a regime change, a new prime minister in office. So just like, the previous regimes, the first few years are characterized by a lack of, properly composed and articulate foreign policy and regional policy. There are some who say that the new government in Ethiopia is departing from multilateralism and adopting a much more bilateral approach. But at the same time, it's also adopting a much more realistic and outward-looking foreign policy, a departure from an inward-looking foreign policy of the EPRDF, despite its assertive role in regional integration and cooperation. The most defining foreign policy developments in the past few years of the Abiy Ahmed's government, of course, is an attempt to build, the Addis Asmara Mogadishu axis. Of course, it crumbled, and there are serious concerns regarding what could happen actually between Ethiopia and Eritrea at the moment. The Tigray War, I believe, even though it was an internal problem, it also had external actors, and it has significantly undermined and dented Ethiopia's foreign policy and its regional role. Another major element is, of course, increased role of the Gulf actors and close cooperation between Ethiopia and especially the UAE on regional issues. But in my view, the most defining element that can determine Ethiopia's regional policy and foreign policy in the coming years will be a very assertive policy regarding Ethiopia's right to maritime access. The previous government, the EPRDF, defined the port issue as an issue of commodity. It's something that we can buy from other states. Of course, there was a plan to diversify Ethiopia's access to ports, including the Lamu project with Kenya, using Port Sudan, Djibouti. But now, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, on numerous occasions, said that the issue of maritime access and port ownership, not just port use, is a matter of survival and existential issue for Ethiopia. So how would that shape Ethiopia's foreign policy and its relationship in IGAD, its role in IGAD and relationship with its neighboring countries will be an interesting element to watch in the coming time. So the MOU with Somaliland has shaken regional cooperation and has a potential, of course, to redraw the geopolitical map of the Horn of Africa and the defining relationship between the countries in the region. So I'll try to, Ethiopia's foreign policy, its relationship with Kenya, I believe, will be determined by three major elements. The first one is Ethiopia is facing numerous challenges at home. So putting its house in order will be very, very important. It is experiencing political instability and it's also experiencing violent conflicts in different parts of the country. So how Ethiopia will manage its internal challenges will be very, very important. Second is how will it pursue its new policy regarding maritime access? Will it use cooperation and negotiation, or will it adopt a much more confrontational approach in its aspiration for a maritime access will be very, very important. But the third part is, we're witnessing unprecedented level of shakeup in the global order, and of course the growing rise of middle powers, Gulf powers in the Red Sea, the Gulf of Eden, the Horn of Africa, and how Ethiopia will position itself in this fast-changing global and regional environment and geopolitical setting will be very critical in determining its foreign policy. And in light of the subsequent regimes in Ethiopia that had a period of the idealism, a period of some extent naivete, how would this government, in a way, the current regime, would come out of its transitional foreign policy will be a space to watch. My concluding slides will be, of course, there was a lot of conversation, there was a lot of talk about Nairobi or Kenya taking over Ethiopia as an anchor state in the Horn of Africa. I believe that is an exaggeration in my view, because first, I don't think Kenya can be an anchor state for two regions, for the Great Lakes and Central Africa, or the EAC region and the Greater Horn region. It is limited by geography, demography, geopolitics, and history. And yes, Ethiopia has numerous weaknesses at the moment. The past few years saw both the vulnerability and resilience of the Ethiopian state. But despite its weaknesses, I don't think Kenya has the right resources and positions to replace Ethiopia on important security and political developments in the Horn of Africa. And recent developments has shown that as well. I think its role in DRC, recent exchanges with Sudan, and even Odinga's loss for his bid for the AUC chairmanship, I believe, showed the limits of Kenya's reach. But this is my last slide, but we adopted a new concept called twin anchor for the Horn and Greater Eastern Africa, because historically the two countries, Ethiopia and Kenya, have been cooperating on important security and diplomatic achievements of the Horn of Africa. As it was mentioned by previous speaker, for example, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, it was signed in Kenya, it was negotiated in Kenya, but after the independence of South Sudan, when a conflict arose between Sudan and South Sudan, it was Ethiopia that deployed AFISMA, the peacekeeping troops. There's a massive cooperation there. And of course, the transitional federal government of Somalia was negotiated in Kenya, in Eldoret, but Ethiopia took the leadership in coordinating, IGASOM and later AMISOM. And the two countries cooperated in the peacekeeping mission in Somalia. With South Sudan in civil war as well. The IGAD mediation team was led by the former Ethiopian Foreign Minister Seyum Mesfin, and the deputy was a Kenyan, General Lazaro. So there's a massive history of cooperation and complementarity between Kenya and Ethiopia, and I believe with current challenges and current developments also provide a great platform for further articulating and developing the twin anchor approach, where both Ethiopia and Kenya articulate their own competitive edges, understand their gaps, and cooperate in addressing regional peace and security issues. Thank you. I'll call Dr. Singo for. Okay, great.
Okay, so just a quick housekeeping note. We're running a little bit behind schedule. And so rather than cutting this conversation short, we're going to eat into lunch a little bit. So apologies for that, but I think that, not to abuse the metaphor, but there's a lot of meat on the bone here that we want to discuss. I want to start off just by, maybe asking a general question of the two of you that leads into these recommendations, which is, how do you see the management of this relationship? I mean, the two presentations, you talked a little bit, or you talked a lot about the respective foreign policies and foreign policy approaches of the two, but very little about the overlap, right? And areas of either friction or how the relationship has been managed over time. And so this idea of a twin anchor approach, which I haven't heard, how do you manage that? Is that an elite bargain, or is it through the two leaders, or is it something that is a much broader, deeper set of arrangements, not unlike what we saw in the earlier example of Kenya in the DRC, where there's a heavy economic component, there's a people component, a cultural component, a political component, security component. You're not seeing the same level of interaction in each other's country in Kenya and Ethiopia. You have a set of shared interests in regional stability. So how do you manage those competing interests going forward?
I think this twin anchor, they have been acting to some extent because, it's difficult. There was a time that Ethiopia was a major peace and security player in the region, especially the time from 2001 to 2014-15.
Yeah.
But even at that time, there was a lot of cooperation and alignment between Nairobi and Addis. But, further articulating the idea of the twin anchor will require first recognizing their own sphere of influence. Just because of geography and history, Kenya's reach will be limited. Ethiopia has some advantages in the northeastern Africa, and Kenya has more advantages on the southern part of that region and the Great Lakes region. That's the first step. And second is, actually, one of the people that we interviewed for this research, a seasoned observer of diplomatic and geopolitical developments in the region, referred to Kenya as a civil society state, and he made that statement in light of the difference between strengths of Ethiopia's and Kenya's military. And their track record, for example, in Somalia. So he's been saying that, Kenya has better advantage in hosting peace processes, but Ethiopia's military capability is no match, for example, for Kenya's. So acknowledging this kind of competitive edges, spheres of influence, but at the same time overlapping interests. For example, in the past couple of weeks, there was a massive development regarding, an understanding between Ethiopia and Kenya on Jubaland, on their policy in Somalia. They have also reached an agreement regarding the movement of an Ethiopian rebel movement in the border between Ethiopia and Kenya. So there has been some kind of increased cooperation and understanding between the two because that relationship was not having its good days, especially immediately after the new administration took over.
I would add 2 points. One is the fact that Kenya and Ethiopia have had a long-standing cooperation, bilateral cooperation. In the military front, you will remember when they were both threatened by Somalia in the 1960s, the Somali irredentism issues, they struck a deal. There's a standing military cooperation between Kenya and Ethiopia, especially as it relates to threats from Somalia. And that's an important point that the two states continue to build on. Then there's point number 2 about complementarity in terms of leveraging on Kenya's soft power and Ethiopia's hard power, which has just been explained by Hale. And I think for me, this is significant because it then means that the two states can continue to work together to complement each other as two major players in the Horn and to stabilize the region from that point of view, because it both benefits them from whatever point of view you look at.
Okay. Themba, I want to bring you into the conversation because you're on this trip and on one of the co-authors of this. One of the points that's been made in here, and I want to ask you from your perspective of being here in Washington, because one of the points that has been made in this morning's conversation is that at one point, Ethiopia was the largest recipient of U.S. counterterrorism assistance and was seen really as an anchor state as defined by Washington and under Washington's list of priorities in this period under Meles Zenawi of 2000 to 2014 or so. And now you have Kenya essentially playing that role now under the past administrations, frankly, since the demise of Meles. And so I'm curious, we've been talking about who the hegemon is or who the anchor state is, and from your perspective, how much is that defined by outside powers, by Washington or by European powers who have sought to instrumentalize Kenya and Ethiopia in pursuit of their own national interests?
I think this is the key part of the key objective of this project. It was, as I said earlier at the beginning, that here we often look at the world from our perspective in Washington, and often to the detriment of the foreign policy of these countries. They have their own foreign policy. What's happening in the Great Lakes is pure reflection of that. Countries with their own interests, doing the things that they judge best to them. So we instrumentalize them, Ethiopia in those days, now Kenya through its major non-NATO status country. And these countries have learned to latch on to our interests in the West and exploit us. Because often we think we are using them, but who's using who is the question. And because any country that has a very clearly defined foreign policy knows where to hang their goals and their interests. So they align with whatever the West, whatever Washington or the EU or somebody else want. And I think we see this. We see the drive of President Ruto in really trying to elbow everybody and being Monsieur l'Afrique. I am Mr. Africa now. Forget Ethiopia, forget Uganda, forget Rwanda. So I think it's a combination of both. I just think for those of us sitting in Washington, D.C. and looking in, we need to acknowledge that. And I don't think often we do. We think it's our calculus that plays a role, when in fact, often they drive those dynamics on the ground as well.
I think just to build on that, it was highlighted in the presentation that within a matter of weeks, Kenya was recognized as a NATO ally, and Ethiopia joined BRICS. So I think this adds another layer of cooperation between the two. In the past few years, Ethiopia, because of the war in Tigray and deteriorating relations with the West, its foreign policy was gearing towards the East. And that trend, I think, somehow continued. Of course, there seems to be improved relations both with Brussels, whatever that means, and Washington. We don't know what kind of relationship would develop with the new administration in Washington. But relations with the Gulf, middle powers in the East has been increasing. So, and Kenya has been getting closer to the West. So how would these two powers and countries in the Horn of Africa manage the influence of the West and the East and the increasing role of middle powers and emerging powers in their region, in the peace processes, political transitions of the Horn of Africa will be very, very critical, and they need to, despite their ideological leanings. I think they have to compare notes, and they have to develop what's best for the region in the long term. What does the long-term interest of on the Red Sea, the Gulf of Eden, and the wider region, from the perspective of Pan-Africanism, from the perspective of an African interest, and the role of the AU and the IGAD should also be part of their their consideration in engaging with their respective allies.
Yeah, I think for me, just to add on to what the two colleagues have said, I think for me, the issue should never be who externally defines who is the anchor state. Whether the Americans think it's Kenya or they think it's Uganda. For me, I think that's the wrong approach. I think the right approach is, why can't that anchor state be determined from the perspective of the region? And I think one of the big criticisms that have come out recently was about President Ruto when, in the context of the problems in Eastern Congo, as chair of the East African Community, he announced that he had spoken to President Macron. And that elicited a lot of criticism, that why would he go to speak to President Macron when you have other African leaders? You have the chair of the African Union, you have African presidents and elder statesmen. Why not consult with his peers in Africa? Why rush to France, which is essentially not an African country? So I think for me it has to be more about the regional leaders speaking to each other more, understanding that really change will never come from outside. The change will always, meaningful change, sustainable change for the people of the region and Africa in general will come from inside Africa. It will never come from outside, because, history has shown that if you are weak, it's only yourself who can make yourself stronger. So for me, I think there needs to be more consultations, more complementarity. I think these regional mechanisms for peace that attract multiple membership. Kenya is a member of EAC, Kenya is a member of IGAD. That's a plus, should be a plus. And we should then be able to see the leaders consulting more and relating more positively with each other than looking outside.
Cameron, I think this is part of the challenge that we face in all these organizations, is just the respect of the charter. Yeah. Whatever charter that drive those institutions, whether it's IGAD, whether it's EAC, if countries will just commit to those charters, it will become very clear where the complementarity is, where your limits are, where your competitive and comparative advantages are. And you take the Horn, it's a big place. All the issues that the two presentations laid out and that we lay in the paper show that there's no single country in the region that can drive changes in all those spaces. Mm-hmm. So it's there, but I think the nationalist drives and ambitions sometimes get on the way of realizing that we actually cannot do this. I think country X is better equipped to do this. How do we work together?
I want to just remind people that we are going to take some audience questions, so get those ready. But maybe if I can bring some of these different threads together here, because it seems that we haven't talked a lot about the role of the AU in managing these conversations, and the role of of both Kenya and Ethiopia in contributing to the functionality of the AU, right? And similarly, we've spoken a little bit more about IGAD, but I think it would not be an unfair criticism to say that both of those organizations in recent years have seen their reputation and credibility eroded, certainly since a period, a decade ago or a little bit more, where they were much more active in peacemaking and peace building around the region, right? Thinking back to the CPA days or to Somalia. At the same time, Haile, you touched a little bit on the role of middle powers and the rising role of middle powers, right? So we're seeing these two trends, I think, and I don't know if we should read them as correlative or causal, this idea that, that you have an increasing role of countries like Turkey, of UAE, of Saudi Arabia, across the region, not just in the commercial side, but really meddling in the politics in a way that we haven't seen before, and in some countries like Somalia or Sudan, you know, being almost determinative to the politics in some ways. And at the same time, regional institutions being less powerful, less able to shape and manage, you know, speaking more about crisis scenarios, of which there's no shortage in this region right now. Do you see these trends as related at all? And is there a role for either Kenya or Ethiopia to play in helping to mitigate it, or are they captured by these trends, and their capture is a reflection of these trends that we see?
One of the most defining foreign policy developments in the post-2018 Ethiopia was the rapprochement with Eritrea. And neither the AU nor IGAD had anything to do with that major geopolitical and regional security development. And of course, the AU took part in the Pretoria peace agreement that resulted in cessation of hostilities between the Ethiopian government and...
But they were invited in at the end, right?
That's true.
Really
but it looks like, I mean, you know, there was a lot of criticism against the current government that it is abandoning the historically, you know, dominant approach Ethiopia has followed, which is multilateralism.
Yeah.
And, you know, increasingly embracing a more bilateral and personalized foreign policy. But, I mean, the last AU summit, it looks like the Ethiopian government used, you know, the recent AU summit as a coming back party in a way. It rejoined the PSC, and it has significantly increased its interest in the AU. Is it a start of a new policy towards the AU? I think we have to wait and see. But definitely there are some developments that are signaling that Addis Ababa has started to retake the AU as a serious platform, because there were serious and legitimate criticisms regarding sidelining the AU and sidelining the IGAD on major both local and regional issues. And as you know, the two biggest countries of IGAD, Ethiopia and Sudan, they had existential crisis. You know, the civil war, political instability, and violent conflict, and both of them have undermined the possible, you know, meaningful role of IGAD. And I think it's time to rethink the role of IGAD in its rationale. But we have to wait and see if the kind of increased interest to use the AU and to take AU seriously by the government in Addis can also be projected to IGAD in the coming months and years.
Yeah, I think let me go back. Some years back, in 2006, the African Union and the UN mediated or led an initiative that led to the establishment of the International Conference of the Great Lakes region, ostensibly to mediate the crisis in Eastern Congo, to create peace, especially for DRC. And the experience from the ICGLR and how the ICGLR has now been rendered an ineffective institution mirrors the issue of divergent national interests, if you will, or the incompatible pursuit of interests that don't converge, you know, in terms of achieving the overall objective. Because when you look at the ICGLR mechanism, now it had come to a level where it was Angola that was leading it, pushing it. I think we are still in that situation now. But Rwanda and Burundi are fighting. We heard from the earlier conversation here. DRC and Rwanda cannot see eye to eye. Now Kenya and DRC are not in good terms. So what do you see as a result? The result is the systemic weakening of this institution, which was supposed to be playing a very important role in mediating peace for these countries. I think the same thing can be said of IGAD or EAC or any other organization. If the leadership is not united, if you have member states pursuing divergent interests, then the regional organizations cannot be effective. It will not work. Coming to your question, I think it is not just the Middle Eastern countries that are coming into play. I think also China. You cannot write out the influence of China. Kenya is actively engaged with the UAE. I think, there was a UAE delegation in Nairobi, I think, was it 2 weeks ago. So UAE, Saudi Arabia, these powers are very actively engaged in terms of bilateral relations with Kenya, bilateral relations with Ethiopia, with Djibouti, etc. At the end of the day, I go back to the same question that I said. Ultimately, sustainable peace and security in the region depends on the extent to which these member states prioritize their own interests in peace and stability and development for their people. Because if you allow yourselves to be misused, then it ends up within the situation where your countries remain unstable. So I think one has to look at it from that point of view. The actors are many, the interests are varied, but at the end of the day, it's about what the leadership in the region sees as their ultimate goal. Is it stability, or is it infighting and the kind of chaos that we have seen happening lately? Yeah.
One quick point.
Sure.
In 20 seconds. Ethiopia feels like it's being choked. It sees both opportunity in the rise of the middle powers, because the power asymmetry between both military power, economic power, and diplomatic power, asymmetry between the Gulf, or the east shore of the Red Sea and the west shore of the Red Sea is widening. Yeah. So it sees an opportunity to some extent through military support, investment, trade, and cooperation, but at the same time, the increased presence of military presence of middle powers in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Eden, it's creating a sense of suffocation and choking in Ethiopia. So in 2018, Ethiopia initiated, for example, the establishment of the IGAD Red Sea and Gulf of Eden Task Force. It sees IGAD, because it's not a literal state of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Eden, so it sees IGAD as a way of, presenting the region and using the region and the regional infrastructure to reach the sea, and to articulate this growing presence and power of the middle powers as a regional concern. Yeah.
There's a friction in what the countries want and the maturity of those countries in terms of institutional, right? So you have 8 countries that's in EAC. I'm not talking about too much IGAD, the EAC, for instance. There are different levels of their own maturity in terms of institutions. Kenya is a democracy. Nobody is fearing of Kenya. Well, this may change, going back to some dictatorship days. I think it's maturing enough to be, whatever the friction may be between Ruto and Odinga and Uhuru Kenyatta, the country will continue moving. Whether it's a civil society country or not, but they will continue moving. You have the DRC that is somewhere in between, strong civil society, institution not working as well. You have Rwanda, which is a hardcore dictatorship. How do you come to be a same community? What is driving that community? What do you call each other out on when you meet? Is that the stability? Is that the will of the people? The organization that works, if you're in the EU, you have to meet certain requirements. It takes years for you to be where everybody else is, and they help you, then you accede to the membership. None of this stuff happens, neither with IGAD or with EAC. So you really have a mismatch of all kinds of dynamics that do not make sense. In the end, people don't know what they're meeting about. Are they meeting about bringing peace in the DRC? What does that mean? You cannot even call the problem out. You cannot even define it because there is no fundamental, no baseline from which to work.
We've got just a couple of minutes left, so if there are questions, I encourage you to come and ask it. Get in line there. Okay.
It's better to take several of them.
Thank you so much.
And let's do a question as opposed to a dissertation.
It will be a question, not a
Okay?
dissertation.
We're going to do like a lightning round.
Yeah, this will go to Kenya. My name is Dennis Owing. I'm from Uganda. Recently, the trial of Dr. Kizza Besigye has raised international concern. He was abducted by the Ugandan intelligence from Nairobi. And other dissidents have also been abducted from Kenya. And Amnesty International actually called that transnational repression of dissidents. Can Kenya still call itself as a peacemaking hub when political dissidents are being abducted from Kenya? Thank you.
We're going to take all three of these questions.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Dawit Haile. I'm from Eritrea. This discussion was wonderful. However, I think that from my point of view, it lacks one very fundamental point. Now here we are talking about whether Ethiopia or Kenya should be the regional anchor states or hegemonic states. However, now the question comes, is that even good? Is that even better? Does it even work? It submerged Eritrea, Ethiopia to over 30, 40, 50 years of war. That very thinking. So my point is, instead of that kind of approach, I think we should have more cooperative and more partnership and have a stronger institutions instead of one being the power and the other is required to submit. So that's kind of comment and question also. I'd like to hear you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Lauren Blanchard with the Congressional Research Service. Wanted to ask you to say a bit more about your views on how some of the recent foreign policy decisions by the Kenyan and Ethiopian governments toward neighboring and regional countries might impact their respective influence in the region, namely referring to the Ethiopian deal, preliminary deal, the MOU, with Somaliland and the pushback from Somalia. Of course, it seems more recently that the Ethiopian government has perhaps set that aside in the context of its renewed relations with Mogadishu. And then with respect to Kenya, the decision to allow the RSF, which is, I think, an insurgent force at this point in Sudan, at least in the view of the UN-recognized authorities in Port Sudan, the decision to allow them to announce a parallel government in not only in Nairobi, but in a Kenyan government-owned facility, and sort of how you see that, the region reacting to those two decisions.
That's a great geographic spread of questions, too. So I'll let you all handle those questions. And I would add maybe just an addendum to Lauren's question with respect to recent developments on Kenya. We haven't talked about what seems like a pretty embarrassing loss for the Kenyans at the AU summit 2 weeks ago, where they had invested quite substantial amounts of not just diplomatic capital, but capital in shepherding Odinga around the continent for many, many months. So what is that message that Kenyans take away from that? So why don't I start with you, Doctor?
Okay, thank you, Chair. I want to respond to the questions together. The first question by the gentleman from Uganda and the question by my sister and your question. I'll combine them. Besigye's abduction from Nairobi it was actually soon followed by another abduction of a Tanzanian activist. And of course, there have been quite a number of other local or domestic abductions. It does not paint the Kenyan government in very positive light. And I wish this was coming in when the ambassador was here, because it should have been good for the ambassador to respond from a very official point of view, because I don't speak for the government myself. So it's not good. It does not enhance Kenya's image and stature as a regional anchor in peacemaking diplomacy. Instead, it negates that particular position of Kenya. It takes away marks, it does not add. And it's the same thing about the question that you have asked about the recent decisions by the Kenyan government to allow a situation where the RSF leadership meets in Nairobi, in actually a very significant location. They met at the Kenyatta International Conference Center. Now, if you know Nairobi, that's a major government building where major conferences are held. So for the RSF to meet in Nairobi and to announce that they are going to establish a parallel government, of course the government of Kenya denied that later. They also issued a statement and denied that they were there to establish a parallel government. The Kenyan foreign minister spoke and said that for Kenya, that is not taking sides. Kenya is a neutral ground for all the players in the Sudan conflict. They can come to Nairobi and they etc. But of course, the perception is very different. The act itself speaks volumes. And it's not just that. Kenya also, early on in the presidency of William Ruto, Kenya also allowed a situation where Congolese rebel forces, representatives of Congolese rebel forces met in Nairobi and announced the fact that they were coming together, building a coalition to remove President Tshisekedi from power. And they said they would go back to Goma and actualize that. Now, that is unraveling now. It's actually happening. So these two incidents, the RSF, then the M23 rebels situation has not augured well for Kenya's leadership in peace diplomacy. It raises fundamental questions about the Kenyan government's foreign policy towards countries that are in conflict, because it looks like it sends a message that we are taking sides. Never mind that the government has come out in this last instance and denied it, but the perception already has been created that, but they are meeting in a government facility. Can they do that without the acknowledgement and approval of the government? So that does not, I think the straightaway question is that it does not paint Kenya in a very good light in terms of its decades-long, achievements in peace diplomacy. And then that, of course, vindicates my brother here, who in quite a number of discussions has been saying, wait a minute, Nairobi must be called out for this and that. So it is correct. Now, when it comes to the African Union failure of Raila Odinga to clinch the AUC chairmanship, I think it has also been linked. Many Kenyan commentators have said that Raila Odinga failed because he was being confronted by the government of William Ruto, who is erstwhile his political enemy in Kenya. And that it's like Kenya was transferring its dirty linen, in quotes, to the African Union Commission. So some people have blamed the failure of Raila Odinga to the fact that it was being propped by the presidency of William Ruto, who some commentators feel like his recent foreign policy pronouncements and actions have really downgraded Kenya's influence and abilities in the region. And they cite the president's, or the Kenya Kwanza government's position on the Sahrawi question, which is contrary to African Union position, the Kenya government's position on the Palestinian question in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is contrary to the African Union position, and the pronouncement by Kenya, by the United States, that Kenya is a NATO ally. That also is interpreted as the fact that Kenya is being projected more as a mouthpiece and whatever of the West, again, contrary to the Pan-Africanism stances of the African Union. So when you look at all these factors, they explain, they have been fronted as explaining the loss by Raila Odinga, and that many feel that it was inevitable, that Raila Odinga was never going to win the African Union chairmanship because of quite a number of these factors. Add that to the SADC question, the failure in the Eastern Congo, etc., etc., and then you have your own answers there. Thank you. Sorry for taking.
No, it's okay. You had a question on Eritrea, and is it a good thing to have a hegemon?
I think we have to start from making a distinction between a hegemon and an anchor state. I think a hegemon is a much more dominating, it has a lot of negative connotation. And in the course of talking to informants on the ground as well, there is a realization that no country can be hegemon. It doesn't have the resources, the internal stability, or the ambition as well. And there was an adoption of an anchor state. And sometimes some states, because of their environment, there may not be a need to be a proactive player on regional peace and security. If you're Namibia or, I don't know, or Zambia, I'm not saying that they don't have a strong foreign policy, but they may not be as proactive as some states in the Horn of Africa or in conflict-prone regions. So by the fate of history, geography, the nature of the state, and the kind of conflicts, in the region, I think some states believe that, having, as I said, for example, in my view, I strongly believe that the EPRDF in the 90s believed that, poverty was my biggest problem. I don't have any external threats. The threats Ethiopia faced in the 80s and 70s came from the problem of the previous regimes and not necessarily from the nature of the government, not the nature of the state. But sometimes I think, the kind of, the series of rude awakenings from mid to the late 90s pushed the EPRDF to adopt a much more proactive foreign policy. But I completely agree with you that the idea of an anchor state must be rooted in multilateralism and in cooperation. And because some countries may not have the ambition to be a regional player, some countries may not have the need, some others may not have the resources. And definitely one of the things that we recommended in the report was, for example, to significantly improve the legitimacy and capacity of IGAD to be a regional player in addressing regional security issues. And definitely you raise an important point regarding how this idea of anchor state is perceived, because the report also acknowledged that, for example, Ethiopia has been the chair of IGAD from 2008 until 2018. Yeah. For about 10 years. So a lot of people legitimately thought and took IGAD as the extension of Ethiopia's foreign policy. And in that context, I think other members of IGAD, or even other members of the international community, may not take IGAD as a genuine multilateral platform. So it should go hand in hand with, I think, the will to take more role on regional issues should go hand in hand with recognizing the basic principle of international relations, which is the sanctity of the equal membership of member states and nation states in regional international issues.
Member, do you want to try to wrap up everything here?
Just 30 seconds.
Let people eat their lunch.
That's all right. So when we were in Ethiopia doing this research, we spoke with a few senior diplomats, and one said, we wish there would not be all these parallel processes for peace in Sudan. What we need is IGAD. everything should come to IGAD. We talked to another senior diplomat who's retired. He said, you know, we need IGAD now. As Ethiopia, we need IGAD, but we destroyed IGAD, you know, to the point that Hallelujah just made about we were the chair, we kind of captured IGAD for our own purposes. Nobody now put credibility into it. We need it. Nobody's there to do it. So this ties to the point you're making about the middle powers who are now having their own processes, you know, Emiratis, Qataris, and so on. So that's one side. And then we went to Kigali, meeting with a Rwandan general. We're just talking about the region, the dynamics, and he said, whatever you do, please, I hope, I didn't mention anything, just talk about research. I hope you do not talk about this word, hegemon. So everybody's sensitive about it, and I think it's a word that we should not be using in the region. For the reason that Ali just mentioned, countries don't have the capacity. Sometimes they have totally outblown ambitions, but it's not anchored in the reality. Sometimes the need is not there, but you want to be important, therefore you want to behave like it. So in the end, it's not helping. I think the way we structured the research, as you can tell, there are a lot of disagreement between Ethiopia, Kenya, and that was kind of the convener of everything else. I think countries have limitations, countries have dreams, countries have genuine concerns. I think we need to strengthen these platforms, the IGADs of the world, the EAC, but they should not be by default you're a member. That's what is killing it. You cannot be a member by default. You have to be a member because you meet the requirement, you meet the conditions, you prepared yourself for it, and then the leaders in the country should commit their countries to respecting those, not individuals. So part of the problem with Kenya is not clear. Kenya has a foreign policy document, but it's not clear what the foreign policy is because every major politician in Kenya has his own foreign policy that he's willing to take on the road. So in the end, when you take the conflict between politicians and everybody projecting, people don't know where Kenya stands, even though they have the ambition to be an anchor state. I'll rest my case there.
Okay, thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists and for their report and their comments. Do we have a...